Listen carefully, because the military tribunals tried to bury this file for 50 years. When the 104th Orbital Infantry retreated from the mud-choked hellscape of Tartarus 9, they made a catastrophic tactical error. They left an unblooded 19-year-old cadet behind to guard a worthless, flooded supply trench. He had a cracked rifle, a handful of leftover explosives, and absolute radio silence. The alien armada, advancing on his position, thought they were walking into an empty graveyard. But by dawn, the galaxy's most ruthless empire wasn't just retreating, they were begging for mercy. This is the classified, terrifying story of how one human cadet turned a muddy ditch into hell. Rain did not fall on Tartarus 9. It was fired at the ground like artillery. The heavy, acidic precipitation turned the continent of Oakhaven into a sprawling nightmare of gray mud and pulverized rock. Within this desolate expanse sat Outpost 44, a jagged scar in the earth that the 104th Orbital Infantry affectionately called the Ditch. For 3 weeks, the 104th had bled into that mud. They were holding the line against the Vracs, a towering, heavily armored, multi-limbed species whose entire culture revolved around relentless, grinding conquest. The Vracs did not take prisoners. They did not negotiate. They simply marched forward, absorbing casualties until the enemy broke. And finally, the 104th broke. Cadet Thomas Hayes was 19 years old. He had been in active combat for exactly 11 days. His uniform was entirely caked in the gray sludge of Tartarus. His helmet was a size too large, and his hands had not stopped shaking since his first drop. He wasn't supposed to be on the front line. Cadets were meant to be logistical runners, kept safe behind the heavy artillery batteries. But the Vracs had flanked the artillery 3 days ago, and every able-bodied human with a pulse had been shoved into the ditch. The retreat order came at 1,800 hours. It wasn't an organized withdrawal. It was a desperate, panicked scramble. The orbital dropships were taking heavy anti-air fire, and command had given the 104th exactly 12 minutes to evacuate before the ships abandoned them to the Vrac swarm. Sergeant Miller, a grizzled veteran missing half of his left ear from a plasma burn, grabbed Hayes by the shoulder rig, his grip bruising the young cadet's collarbone. The sky above them was a terrifying tapestry of neon green anti-air tracers and the fiery streaks of dying drop pods. "Hayes, listen to me." Miller roared over the deafening scream of a low-flying extraction bird. "Private O'Keefe has a shattered femur. Captain Harrison is bleeding out. They are loading the wounded onto the last bird at the northern ridge." "I'm ready, Sergeant. I'm ready to run." Hayes screamed back, his voice cracking, terrified of being left in the dark. "No, you hold here." Miller pointed a thick, mud-stained finger down the length of the flooded supply trench. It was a narrow, zigzagging choke point that led directly to the extraction zone. "The Vracs are pushing through the western ridge. If they get down this trench, they'll slaughter the wounded before the ramp even closes. I need you on that heavy repeater. Hold the angle. 3 minutes, cadet. Just give us 3 minutes. And when you hear the thrusters pop, you run like hell for the ramp." Hayes looked at the weapon Miller was pointing at. It was an M88 heavy rail repeater mounted on a rusted tripod. The gunner, who had previously manned it, was slumped over, missing the upper half of his torso. "Yes, Sergeant." Hayes choked out, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. 3 minutes, Tommy!" Miller yelled, turning to sprint up the mud slick toward the landing zone. "Do not let them through this ditch!" Hayes threw himself behind the heavy repeater. He shoved the dead gunner aside, whispering a frantic apology, and gripped the dual triggers. The metal was freezing. The rain pounded against his visor. He stared down the long, narrow stretch of the trench, waiting for the hulking silhouettes of the Vracs. He counted the seconds. 100. 200. His breathing was ragged, fogging up his visor. He listened desperately for the sound of the dropship's thrusters. Then, the ground shook. A shock wave ripped through the atmosphere, throwing Hayes against the mud wall of the trench. He looked up, his heart stopping in his chest. Through the dense, acidic fog, he saw the 3 massive orbital dropships breaking through the cloud cover. Their blue thrusters ignited, searing the sky as they punched their way into the upper atmosphere. Hayes froze. He looked at his wrist chronometer. It had been barely 2 minutes. They had left early. "Sergeant?" Hayes whispered over the comms. Static hissed back. "Sergeant Miller? Captain Harrison? I'm still in the ditch." The birds left. Silence. The comms network was entirely dead. The localized relay had been taken on the ships. Hayes scrambled up the muddy embankment, risking his life to peer over the top of the trench toward the extraction zone. It was empty. The medical crates were gone. The bodies of the fallen had been left behind. The landing gear indentations were already filling with acidic rain. He was alone. One cadet, a 19-year-old kid from a farming colony who hadn't even passed his advanced infantry exams, was the only human being left within 1,000 miles of hostile territory. Hayes slid back down into the freezing water of the ditch. He curled his knees to his chest and began to hyperventilate. The panic was absolute, a crushing physical weight on his chest. He was going to die here. The Vraks would find him, and they would tear him apart just like they had torn apart the gunner beside him. He wanted to run. He wanted to abandon the trench and hide in the caves to the south. But as the panic peaked, a strange, cold numbness washed over him. The instinct to flee was suddenly overridden by a primal, terrifying realization of finality. There was nowhere to run. The caves were flooded. The plains were patrolled by Vrak hunter-killers. He was dead. It was a mathematical certainty. Hayes slowly uncurled himself. He looked at his trembling hands. If he was already a dead man, the rules no longer applied. He didn't have to worry about surviving. He only had to worry about making his death as expensive as possible for the enemy. He stood up. He wiped the mud from his visor. He looked down the empty trench, then began to walk through the abandoned human positions, his eyes scanning the discarded equipment. If they wanted the ditch, they were going to have to bleed for it. Night fell on Tartarus, 9 like a heavy iron curtain. The only illumination came from the intermittent, eerie green flashes of distant atmospheric lightning. Hayes had spent the last 3 hours preparing to die. The retreating 104th had been forced to leave behind a significant amount of heavy ordnance because it was too heavy to carry on to the overcrowded dropships. Hayes found 6 crates of M4 Claymore anti-personnel mines, 20 belts of tungsten-tipped ammunition for the heavy repeater, a pile of discarded thermal grenades, and, crucially, 3 heavy plasma batteries used to power forward energy shields. He worked with a frantic, obsessive energy. He wired the claymores along the muddy walls of the trench, sinking them just deep enough into the sludge so that their tripwires were entirely hidden beneath the waterline. He didn't set them all at the entrance. He staggered them, creating a corridor of localized death. He rigged the thermal grenades to the plasma batteries, creating improvised explosive devices that would vaporize anything within a 30-foot radius. By 2200 hours, the ditch was no longer a supply trench. It was a 300-meter meat grinder. Hayes sat back behind the M88 repeater. He had scavenged an infrared optical scope from a broken sniper rifle and duct-taped it to his helmet, giving him a grainy, green-tinted view of the darkness. At 2,315, the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't a steady rumble, but a rhythmic, terrifying thudding. Hayes pressed his shoulder into the stock of the repeater. Through the infrared scope, the thermal signatures began to appear. They were massive. The Vraks stood nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies a terrifying amalgamation of reptilian muscle and thick, chitinous armor plating. They carried heavy plasma cannons underslung on their forearms. They moved with an arrogant, lumbering confidence. They had seen the dropships leave. They believed the human outpost was abandoned, a graveyard ripe for scavenging. A vanguard squad of 20 Vraks entered the mouth of the trench. They didn't bother checking corners. They just waded into the knee-deep water, their guttural, clicking language echoing down the muddy walls. Hayes held his breath. His finger hovered over the trigger of the M88. He waited until the lead, Vrak, a massive beast with a scar across its mandibles, was exactly 100 meters away. He waited until they were packed tightly into the narrowest section of the trench. Clack. The lead Vrak kicked a submerged tripwire. 3 M4 claymores detonated simultaneously. The concussive blast in the confined space of the trench was deafening. A wall of thousands of tungsten steel ball bearings ripped through the darkness at supersonic speeds. The front rank of the Vraks was instantly shredded, their heavy armor completely compromised at such close range. Alien blood, glowing a faint, luminescent blue, sprayed across the mud walls. Before the echo of the explosion could even fade, Hayes squeezed the triggers of the heavy repeater. The M88 roared to life, spitting high-velocity rail slugs down the corridor. The muzzle flash illuminated the ditch in strobing, violent yellow light. Hayes screamed, pouring all his terror, his anger, and his youth into the weapon. The heavy tungsten rounds tore through the surviving Vraks in the vanguard, punching holes the size of softballs through their armor. The aliens shrieked a high-pitched, metallic sound and fired back blindly. Bolts of green plasma seared the air above Hayes's head, melting the sandbags around his position. But they were clustered, confused, and trapped in a bottleneck. Hayes didn't stop firing until the repeater's barrel glowed cherry red and the weapon clicked empty. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of melting mud and the gurgling sounds of dying aliens. Hayes slumped back against the sandbags, his chest heaving. He had just wiped out an entire vanguard squad, but the victory was short-lived. A terrifying roar echoed from the plains beyond the trench. It wasn't the sound of 20 Vraks. It was the sound of hundreds. The alien commander outside realized they had walked into an ambush, but the Vraks were not a species that retreated. The roar was an order to swarm. Hayes scrambled to his feet. He ejected the glowing hot barrel of the M88, severely burning his palm through his glove, and slammed a fresh barrel and ammunition belt into the weapon. The second wave didn't lumber. They charged. Dozens of massive, armored bodies poured into the trench, climbing over the corpses of their dead. They fired as they ran, turning the trench into a blinding tunnel of green plasma. Hayes ducked behind the sandbags, waiting for them to cross the second marker. He slammed his fist down on a jury-rigged detonator box. 50 meters down the trench, the thermal grenades attached to the plasma battery detonated. The resulting explosion wasn't just concussive, it was a miniature sun. A dome of white-hot plasma expanded in the ditch, instantly vaporizing everything in its radius. The shockwave blew Hayes backward, throwing him into the mud. His ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine drowning out all other sound. He crawled back to the gun, wiping a mixture of mud and his own blood from his cracked visor. Through the smoke and steam, he saw the Vrak charge had been halted. The trench was blocked by a wall of collapsed earth and smoldering bodies. Hayes looked down at his trembling hands. He was out of claymores. He had one plasma battery left, and the night had barely begun. The Vraks stopped charging. For 2 agonizing hours, the ditch was silent. The alien commander, stationed somewhere in the darkness beyond the outpost, had realized that sending infantry down a narrow, heavily fortified funnel was suicide. They believed they were facing a heavily entrenched, suicidal rearguard squad of elite human shock troopers. They had no idea it was a single, exhausted teenager holding the line. Hayes didn't waste the reprieve. He knew the Vraks wouldn't give up. They were simply changing tactics. If they couldn't push straight down the middle, they would try to flank, scaling the muddy embankments to fire down into the trench from above. He had to make them believe the entire outpost was manned. He had to become a ghost. Moving with frantic purpose, Hayes began scavenging the bodies of the fallen 104th Infantrymen. It felt like a desecration, a horrific violation of the dead, but survival had erased all bounds of propriety. He dragged 4 dead soldiers up to the edge of the trench line. He propped them up against the sandbags, using rusted rebar to keep their torsos upright. He placed their helmets on their heads and positioned their cold hands over the grips of their rifles. But a static dummy wouldn't fool the Vraks' thermal sensors for long. Hayes stripped the chemical heating packs from the medical supplies. He cracked them open and taped them to the chests and helmets of the dead soldiers, creating artificial body heat. To the Vraks' infrared optics, it would look like 5 distinct heat signatures manning the perimeter. Next, he tackled the sound. He gathered every broken, static-filled, short-range radio he could find. He placed them in empty ammunition tins to amplify the acoustics and scattered them along the length of the trench. He tuned them all to maximum volume, locked on a looping frequency of pre-recorded human artillery chatter he found on a dead radio man's datapad. Coordinates: locked, fire for effect, suppressing left flank, incoming. The ghostly, distorted voices echoed down the dark, muddy corridor. At 0300 hours, the Vraks made their move. Instead of a frontal assault, stealth units, sleeker, faster variants of the alien soldiers, equipped with optic camouflage cloaks, began creeping over the top of the trench. They moved silently through the mud, their thermal visors scanning the human defenses. They saw the 5 glowing heat signatures of the rigged bodies. They heard the distorted military chatter echoing from different positions. Believing they had identified the elite squad's perimeter, the stealth units converged on the dummies, uncloaking to deliver lethal point-blank plasma strikes to the dead men. Hayes was waiting 30 yards away, buried up to his neck in the freezing sludge, breathing through a hollowed-out stim tube. He waited until the stealth units were clustered around the dummies. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled the pin on a flashbang grenade and lobbed it over the mudbank. The blinding flash of light shattered the darkness, instantly blinding the highly light-sensitive eyes of the Vraks stealth units. They shrieked, clutching their faces, their optical cloaks short-circuiting in a cascade of blue sparks. Hayes erupted from the mud like a demon. He didn't use the heavy repeater. It was too slow. He had armed himself with a scavenged trench shotgun. He sprinted down the line, sliding through the mud, and unleashed absolute hell. The heavy, 8-gauge buckshot roared, tearing through the unarmored stealth units. He moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline and terror, firing, pumping, firing, pumping. He dropped 5 of them before they could even draw their blades. The last Vrak, a massive elite, blindly swung a heavy kinetic blade, slicing a gash across Hayes' bicep. Hayes screamed in pain, falling backward into the water. The Vrak loomed over him, raising the blade for a killing blow. Hayes didn't hesitate. He pulled his sidearm and fired 3 rounds directly into the alien's jaw. The monster collapsed, crushing Hayes beneath its immense weight. Gasping for air, bleeding heavily from his arm, Hayes shoved the dead alien off his chest. He dragged himself back to his primary position. The illusion had worked. The enemy commander, hearing the gunfire and the screams of his elite stealth unit, was entirely convinced that the ditch was held by a master tactician and a full squad of lethal operatives. But Hayes knew he couldn't pull the same trick twice. His arm was bleeding badly. He was exhausted, hallucinating from blood loss and the toxic fumes of the plasma blasts. The sky was beginning to turn a faint, bruised purple. Dawn was coming, and with dawn, the Vraks would see through the illusions. They would realize there was only one boy, broken and bleeding, sitting in the mud. Hayes leaned against the cold metal of the M88. He looked at the last remaining plasma battery. He looked at the unexploded, massive orbital artillery shell that had been embedded in the mud near the rear of the trench since week 1. Command had ordered everyone to stay away from it. It was volatile. It had enough payload to level half a city block. Hayes began to laugh. It was a broken, wet sound. He dragged the heavy plasma battery toward the unexploded shell. He stripped the wires with his teeth, tasting copper and blood. He began to rig a dead man's switch, wiring the battery directly into the detonator cap of the orbital shell. He wrapped the final tripwire around his own wrist. If his heart stopped, if he lost consciousness and dropped his arm, the circuit would break. The battery would discharge into the shell. The entire outpost, and any alien standing within a quarter mile of it, would be atomized. He sat back in the mud, resting his hand on the trigger of his rifle, the wire taut against his wrist. He stared out into the dark, waiting for the final charge. "Come on," Cadet Hayes whispered to the alien armada. "Welcome to hell." Cold was no longer just a sensation for Cadet Thomas Hayes. It was an entity living inside his chest. The acidic rain of Tartarus 9 had seeped through the microfibers of his combat suit, chilling the sweat and blood plastered to his skin. The gash on his right bicep throbbed with a sickening rhythmic heat. He had managed to wrap a makeshift tourniquet around it using the reinforced webbing from the tactical vest of a dead rifleman, Private First Class Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton had owed Hayes 20 credits from a card game 3 nights ago. Now, Pendleton was a corpse propping up a sandbag, and Hayes was using his gear to stave off exsanguination. The digital clock on his cracked wrist chronometer read 0415 hours. The Vraks had not made a sound for over an hour. This silence was infinitely worse than the screaming of plasma fire. When the enemy was shooting, Hayes knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. The silence meant the alien commander was thinking. The Vraks were a brutal species, but they were not mindless animals. They possessed a terrifying, mechanized intelligence. The failure of their stealth vanguard had clearly communicated that a frontal assault into the narrow throat of Outpost 44 was mathematically unsound. They were adapting. Hayes rested his forehead against the cold receiver of the M88 repeater. His left hand gripped the pistol grip. His right hand lay perfectly still in his lap. The stripped copper wire pulled taut against his wrist. If he passed out, his hand would drop, the wire would snap the circuit shut, and the unexploded orbital shell 20 feet behind him would turn the entire grid square into a crater. He had to stay awake. To keep his mind from snapping, Hayes began reciting the operational manual for the standard issue atmospheric rebreather. Step 1. Ensure the primary intake valve is free of obstruction. Step 2. Depress the chemical activation tab. A low, rhythmic vibration interrupted his recitation. It didn't come from the mouth of the trench, it came from the earth itself. Hayes adjusted the fractured infrared scope taped to his helmet. The green-tinted darkness revealed nothing at ground level. The vibration grew louder, shifting from a subtle tremor to a heavy, mechanical grinding. Then, he saw it. Looming over the western ridge of the trench line, silhouetted against the ambient lightning of the storm, was a Vrak siege walker. The infantry called them Goliaths. It was a massive quadrupedal armor unit, heavily plated in overlapping sheets of black, carbon-scored metal. It carried twin-linked heavy plasma mortars on its back and a heavy rotary cannon slung beneath its chassis. The machine moved with a jerky hydraulic grace, positioning itself directly above the trench, looking down into the muddy corridor like a hunter peering into a burrow. Hayes's blood ran cold. The Goliath wasn't going to enter the trench. It was going to collapse it from above, burying the human defenders alive beneath tons of liquid mud and rock. The walker's mechanical joints whined as it aimed its rotary cannon downward. It was targeting the reinforced retaining walls of the ditch. Hayes had no anti-armor weaponry left. The M88's tungsten slugs would bounce off the Goliath's carapace like hail off a tin roof. He had no grenades, no claymores, no rockets. He only had the dead man's switch. But detonating the orbital shell now would kill him, while the Goliath, positioned high on the ridge, might actually survive the directed blast wave of the trench walls. "Think, Tommy. Think," he muttered to himself, his voice a hoarse rasp. He looked frantically around the devastated outpost. His eyes locked onto the primary fuel line running along the upper edge of the trench. Outpost 44 had been powered by a heavy promethium generator located at the far end of the ridge. The fuel line, a thick, reinforced steel pipe, ran parallel to the Goliath's current position, carrying highly pressurized, volatile liquid promethium to the now abandoned heating units in the bunkers. Hayes didn't hesitate. He couldn't aim the heavy M88 repeater upward at that extreme angle. He unholstered his sidearm, a standard-issue M11 heavy pistol, with his trembling left hand. The Goliath's rotary cannon began to spin, a low mechanical whine signaling the impending barrage. Hayes ignored the walker. He aimed the pistol at the promethium line running exactly 10 feet below the Goliath's massive, heavily armored feet. His left hand shook violently. He took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. Crack. The first shot missed, sparking against the rock face. Crack. The second shot hit the steel pipe, but failed to penetrate. The Goliath's cannon opened fire. A torrent of high-explosive rounds tore into the trench walls 50 yards away from Hayes, instantly vaporizing the mud and sending massive shockwaves of displaced earth down the corridor. The ditch was collapsing. Crack. The third armor-piercing pistol round struck the promethium line at a weakened joint. The pipe ruptured with a violent hiss. Highly pressurized liquid promethium sprayed in a massive, arching geyser directly upward, coating the underbelly and legs of the Goliath walker in a thick, highly flammable sheen. The Vrak pilot inside the walker realized the danger too late. The machine tried to step back, its heavy metallic feet slipping on the promethium-slicked mud. Hayes dropped the pistol and swung the M88 repeater around. He didn't aim at the walker. He aimed at the pool of liquid promethium cascading down the trench wall, pooling near the sparking, ruined remains of an electrical junction box. He pulled the trigger. The tungsten slug struck the junction box. A shower of electrical sparks rained down into the fuel. The ignition was instantaneous. A pillar of roaring orange fire erupted from the trench wall, traveling up the stream of fuel like a fuse. When the fire hit the Goliath, the promethium coating its chassis ignited in a catastrophic fireball. The temperature spiked so drastically that Hayes felt his eyebrows singe from 50 yards away. The Goliath walker shrieked a horrific combination of tearing metal and the alien screams of the pilot cooking alive inside the cockpit. The intense heat caused the walker's internal ammunition reserves to cook off. A chain of secondary explosions ripped through the machine's upper carapace. The massive metal beast staggered blindly, its hydraulic legs melting, before it completely lost its footing and collapsed backward down the ridge, tumbling into the darkness away from the trench in a rolling sphere of fire. Hayes dropped his head onto his knees, gasping for oxygen as the fire burned through the breathable air in the ditch. He had stopped the siege engine, but his vision was tunneling. The edges of the world were turning black. He looked down at his right hand. The fingers were blue. The wire was still tight. "Just a little longer," he whispered to the corpses surrounding him. "Just hold the line." The sky over Tartarus 9 did not produce a beautiful sunrise. The thick, toxic cloud cover simply shifted from an oppressive, bruised black to a sickly pale violet. But it was light. The darkness was breaking. The acidic rain had finally slowed to a dismal drizzle. As the gloom lifted, the true scale of the slaughter became visible. The muddy floor of the trench was a butcher's yard of alien corpses. Green luminescent blood marbled the gray sludge, and the air was thick with the stench of ozone, burnt promethium, and death. Cadet Thomas Hayes sat perfectly still behind the sandbags. He was covered from head to toe in a thick crust of dried mud and blood. His eyes were bloodshot, staring blankly down the 300-meter corridor. He looked less like a human soldier and more like a macabre statue carved directly out of the earth of Tartarus. As the light expanded, the Vraks finally saw the outpost. Hundreds of massive alien soldiers lined the distant plains, their armor gleaming in the dull morning light. They had surrounded the entire ridge. They stood in rigid, disciplined formations, waiting for the order to completely overwhelm the human position. But they did not charge. Through their advanced optics, the Vrak command structure finally got a clear look at Outpost 44. They saw the destroyed vanguard. They saw the charred remains of the stealth elites. They saw the collapsed ridge where the Goliath had burned. And, most importantly, they saw the heat signatures. The chemical packs Hayes had taped to the corpses had died hours ago. The Vrak sensors registered only one living organism in the entire complex. A murmur rippled through the alien ranks, a discordant symphony of metallic clicks and guttural growls. The alien commander, a towering warlord clad in ceremonial crimson armor, stepped to the front of the line. He stared down into the trench, disbelief warring with tactical reality. The elite human strike force that had decimated his forces did not exist. His army had been stalled, bled, and humiliated by a single, severely wounded human. The warlord raised a heavily armored hand, signaling his troops to hold. He did not order an attack. He ordered an emissary. A smaller, unarmored Vrak wearing the mechanical harness of a translation drone stepped forward and began the long walk down the center of the trench. The emissary walked slowly, stepping carefully over the mutilated bodies of its own kind. Hayes watched the alien approach. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't have the strength left to lift the M88. He just watched with hollow, exhausted eyes. The emissary stopped exactly 30 feet from Hayes's sandbag barricade. The mechanical drone on its chest whirred, translating the alien's clicking language into heavily synthesized, metallic English. "Human warrior," the drone broadcasted, the voice echoing off the muddy walls. "You are the final survivor. Your tactical brilliance has earned the respect of the warlord, but your ammunition is depleted. Your physical form is failing. You are entirely surrounded. The warlord demands your immediate surrender. You will be taken as a prisoner of high value. Lower your weapons." Hayes stared at the emissary. He blinked slowly, clearing the grit from his eyes. He looked down at his left hand, resting limply on his knee. Then, he looked at his right hand. Slowly, agonizingly, Hayes stood up. His legs shook violently beneath his weight. The mud sucked at his boots. He leaned heavily against the sandbags to keep from collapsing. He didn't look like a warrior. He was 19 years old, pale, emaciated, and bleeding from half a dozen wounds. The Vrak emissary tilted its head, processing the visual of this frail creature. Hayes didn't speak to the emissary. He looked past it, staring directly up at the crimson-armored warlord standing on the distant ridge. With painful deliberation, Hayes raised his right arm into the air. The copper wire, tied securely around his wrist, pulled tight. The line trailed down from his arm, snaking through the mud, running directly into the detonator cap of the massive, unexploded orbital artillery shell resting just 10 feet behind the barricade. The Vraks possessed advanced optical scanners. Every soldier on that ridge, including the warlord, zoomed in on the human's raised hand. They traced the wire. They recognized the horrific scale of the human orbital munition. They calculated its payload. a dead man's switch. If they shot him, his heart would stop, his arm would drop, and the switch would close. If they rushed him, he would drop his arm intentionally. The blast radius of the orbital shell would not just vaporize the trench. It would turn the entire surrounding plane, including the warlord and his entire command battalion, into a crater of glass. The translation drone on the emissary clicked frantically, trying to process the sudden shift in the tactical geometry. "Human, explain your action," the drone stammered, the synthesized voice lacking its previous authority. Hayes coughed, spitting a glob of bloody phlegm into the mud. He looked at the emissary, a terrifying, cracked smile spreading across his blood-stained face. "I don't need ammo," Hayes rasped, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the heavy, crushing weight of absolute madness. "And I'm not a warrior. I'm just the guy they left behind to guard the ditch." He swayed slightly, the wire maintaining its deadly tension. "You want this ditch?" Hayes yelled, his voice suddenly breaking into a feral, desperate roar that echoed across the silent battlefield. "Come and take it! Shoot me! Step forward! Do it!" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound completely devoid of sanity or fear. It was the sound of a human being who had entirely accepted death, and in doing so, had become utterly invincible. The Vrak emissary took a slow, terrified step backward. On the ridge, the Crimson Warlord watched the laughing, bleeding boy. The Vraks understood conquest. They understood overwhelming firepower. They understood tactical sacrifice. But they could not comprehend the sheer, spiteful malice of a creature willing to trigger a weapon of mass destruction purely out of defiance. It broke their tactical algorithms. It was not war. It was planetary suicide. The warlord looked at the devastating payload of the shell. He looked at the trembling arm of the boy holding the fate of an entire battalion. Slowly, the warlord lowered his weapon. He turned his back on the trench and let out a long, resonant roar. It was not a roar of attack. It was the order to withdraw. The invincible Vrak Armada, the terror of the outer colonies, began to step backward. They did not run, but they moved with a frantic urgency, desperate to put distance between themselves and the madman in the mud. The mechanized walkers reversed. The infantry turned away. Hayes stood there, his arm raised, trembling violently, watching the greatest military force in the sector retreat from a flooded ditch. He didn't lower his arm. He didn't dare. He stood in the gray morning light, the undisputed king of a graveyard, holding back an empire with a piece of copper wire and the terrifying power of human stubbornness. Rain began to fall again, a slow, stinging drizzle that washed the drying blood from Cadet Thomas Hayes's face. The Vrak Armada had retreated exactly 600 meters from Outpost 44, positioning themselves in a massive, semicircular barricade just outside the calculated blast radius of the unexploded orbital shell. They did not fire. They did not advance. They simply watched the lone human standing in the mud. Military historians and psychologists analyzing the classified Tartarus, 9 files decades later, would often compare Hayes's terrifying isolation to that of real-world heroes from ancient Earth, specifically Private First. Class Thomas Baker at Saipan in 1944, a soldier who, heavily wounded and unable to walk, demanded to be propped against a tree with a single pistol to hold off an advancing enemy battalion. But Baker had known his sacrifice would buy his comrades time. Hayes was operating under the assumption that his comrades were already safe, and his death was simply an administrative delay for the alien empire. Hayes's arm was entirely numb. The copper wire dug viciously into his skin, the tension the only thing keeping the improvised circuit open. His knees buckled, and he slowly sank back down into the freezing gray sludge, resting his back against the sandbags. He carefully rested his right arm on his raised knee, ensuring the wire remained perfectly taut. He was dying. The gash on his bicep was infected, radiating a sickening heat that made his vision swim with dark, violent spots. He had maybe 8 hours before dehydration and blood loss put him into a terminal coma. When that happened, his arm would slip, and the trench would vanish in a localized nuclear yield flash. A sudden, sharp crackle of static broke the oppressive silence. Hayes flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound hadn't come from the Vrak lines. It came from the muddy floor of the trench. A heavy, military-grade AN, PRC, 320 long-range communication module, dropped by a fleeing radio man the night before, lay half-submerged in a puddle. Its red indicator light was blinking frantically. Hayes stared at it. He couldn't reach it without moving his arm. Moving his arm meant slacking the wire, biting down on his lower lip until he tasted fresh blood. Hayes began a terrifying millimeter-by-millimeter slide down the sandbag wall. He kept his right arm locked rigidly in place, shifting his entire torso to maintain the distance to the detonator cap. He extended his left boot, hooked the heavy strap of the radio, and dragged it through the mud toward his chest. Gasping from the agonizing effort, he used his left hand to flick the receiving switch. Outpost 44. Repeat. Any element of the 104th at Outpost 44. This is Orbital Command. Do you read? The voice was human. It was crisp, female, and utterly devoid of the localized static that plagued the surface frequencies. Hayes squeezed his eyes shut. A single, hot tear cut a track through the mud on his cheek. "Command," he croaked, his throat so dry it sounded like crushed glass. "This is Cadet Thomas Hayes. Serial number 884. Bravo. I am at Outpost 44. I am the only one left." A heavy, stunned silence fell over the radio. When the voice returned, the crisp military professionalism had fractured slightly. "Cadet Hayes, this is Lieutenant Sarah Collins, aboard the command carrier Aegis Sun. The evacuation ships from your sector lifted off 12 hours ago. We registered your outpost as overrun. How are you alive?" "I rigged an unexploded orbital shell to a dead man's switch," Hayes answered, his voice completely flat, devoid of pride or fear. "The Vraks pushed to the perimeter, but they backed off. They are sitting 600 meters out." Staring at me, Lieutenant Collins swore softly over the open channel. "Cadet, listen to me very carefully. The dropships that left your position, they didn't make it to orbit. The Vrak anti-air batteries on the western ridge tore them apart in the upper atmosphere. The 104th is gone." Hayes stopped breathing. The cold inside him crystallized, turning into something infinitely heavy. Sergeant Miller, Captain Harrison, the wounded, they had burned up in the sky. He had held the ditch to buy them time, and they had died anyway. "Why are they still here, Lieutenant?" Hayes asked, his voice chillingly calm. "If the outpost is dead, why did they send hundreds of troops to take a flooded supply trench?" Keyboard clattering echoed through the comms link. "We just cross-referenced orbital scans, Hayes. Outpost 44 isn't just a trench. It sits directly on top of a massive subterranean geothermal vent. The Vraks aren't trying to secure a supply route. They are trying to build a planetary shield generator. If they tap that vent, they can power a Class 4 kinetic barrier over the entire continent. The human fleet will never be able to bombard them. And we will lose Tartarus. 9 forever. You are sitting on the most important piece of real estate on the planet." Hayes looked up at the Vrak lines. Through the haze, he could see massive, heavy-lift dropships descending from the clouds behind the enemy vanguard. They were lowering colossal, black metallic structures to the ground. Shield emitters. "They're bringing the generator parts down now," Hayes reported. "We see it on the scans," Collins replied, her voice tinged with desperation. "Hayes, we cannot launch an orbital strike. The atmospheric interference from their jamming ships is too thick. If they assemble that core and activate it, the war is over. We need that geothermal vent destroyed. If your orbital shell detonates over the vent, it will collapse the crust and bury the fissure permanently. Hayes looked over his shoulder. The unexploded shell was massive. A brutal cylinder of dark gray steel, but it was sitting at the entrance of the trench, a full 200 yards away from the rear of the outpost, where the geothermal fissure violently vented steam into the toxic air. The shell is in the wrong place, Hayes said. If I drop my hand right now, it'll vaporize the Vanguard, but it won't scratch the fissure. The generator will survive. Can you rewire it? Collins asked. No. I'm out of wire. I'm out of everything. Silence stretched over the radio, heavy with the grim arithmetic of war. Cadet Hayes, Collins said, her voice trembling. I am so sorry. Hayes looked at the blinking light of the radio. He looked at the bodies of the 104th scattered around him. They had died believing they were escaping. He was the only one left who knew the truth. Don't be sorry, Lieutenant, Hayes whispered. Just tell the fleet to watch the surface. I'm going to finish the job. He reached over and clicked the radio off. The connection to humanity severed. Hayes was entirely alone once more. But the despair that had threatened to consume him was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying hyper-focus. He wasn't a guard anymore. He was the executioner. Hayes needed his right hand. He could not move a 2,000-pound munition with a wire tied to his wrist. He looked around the immediate vicinity of his makeshift bunker. 3 feet to his left lay the body of Private Samuel Jenkins. Jenkins had taken a plasma bolt to the chest during the initial retreat. He had been dead for over 14 hours. In the freezing temperatures of Tartarus, 9 rigor mortis had set in completely, turning the young private's body into a rigid, unyielding statue. Hayes shifted his weight, wincing as the torn muscle in his arm screamed in protest. He reached out with his left boot, hooking Jenkins by the tactical webbing, and slowly dragged the stiffened corpse across the mud until it rested against the sandbags. Sweat poured down Hayes's face, washing the mud into his eyes. He carefully reached over with his left hand and gripped Jenkins's cold, stiff right arm. He positioned the dead man's hand directly over the copper wire. "Hold this for me, Sammy," Hayes whispered, a manic edge creeping into his voice. With excruciating slowness, Hayes began to transfer the tension of the wire from his own wrist to the rigid fingers of the dead soldier. He wrapped the copper tightly around Jenkins's thumb and forefinger, pulling the dead arm back until the tension perfectly matched the required pull of the detonator switch. Hayes held his breath, his own pulse roaring in his ears. He slowly slid his wrist out of the loop. The wire held. Jenkins's rigor-locked arm did not budge a millimeter. The circuit remained open. Hayes collapsed backward into the mud, gasping for air, staring at the dead man holding the trigger to a localized apocalypse. He had bought himself mobility, but the clock was ticking faster now. Rigor mortis was not permanent. As the tissue continued to break down, Jenkins's arm would eventually go limp, and the shell would detonate. He had perhaps an hour. Hayes forced himself to stand. He grabbed a discarded medical kit, injected himself with 2 maximum dose ampules of synthetic adrenaline, and felt a violent electric jolt rip through his nervous system. The pain in his arm dulled to a distant throb, replaced by a jittery, blinding energy. He stumbled toward the rear of the trench, past the mangled bodies of the stealth elites. At the far end of Outpost 44, half buried in a collapsed supply tunnel, sat a destroyed human logistics truck. The cabin was melted slag, but the heavy-duty industrial winch mounted to the rear chassis appeared intact. Hayes engaged the winch's manual release. He grabbed the heavy steel towing cable and dragged it back down the 300-meter length of the trench, slipping and sliding in the bloody mud, his boots kicking up splashes of luminescent green alien blood. He reached the unexploded orbital shell. The massive steel cylinder was sunk deep into the Earth. Hayes wrapped the heavy steel towing cable around the midsection of the shell, locking the industrial carabiner in place with a heavy clack. He sprinted back to the truck at the rear of the trench, directly over the steaming geothermal vent. He engaged the manual override on the winch's motorized drum. He had no power cells left. But the truck's auxiliary kinetic battery still held a minimal charge. He slammed his fist against the activation lever. The winch groaned. The metal cable pulled taut, snapping straight with the sound of a cracking whip. Deep in the mud at the front of the trench, the 2,000-pound orbital shell shifted. A high-pitched mechanical whine filled the air as the winch strained against the immense weight. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive shell began to drag through the sludge, carving a deep, ugly furrow down the center of the trench. Out on the plains, the Vrak warlord noticed the movement. Through his advanced optical visor, the alien commander watched the humans' horrifying endeavor. He saw the dead soldier, holding the wire at the front barricade. He saw the bleeding boy at the rear of the trench, operating a winch. He saw the weapon of mass destruction slowly sliding down the corridor, moving directly toward the geothermal vent. The warlord realized instantly what the human was doing. If that shell detonated over the vent, the planetary shield generator they were currently assembling would be rendered completely useless. Millions of credits and thousands of lives spent to secure this position would be for nothing. The warlord roared a command. The siege was over. The human had forced their hand. The ground began to shake violently. From behind the Vrak lines, a colossal machine crested the ridge. It was a shield corps crawler, a heavily armored, treaded behemoth carrying the primary plasma reactor for the planetary shield. It was flanked by 4 fresh squads of heavy shock infantry. They were not going to wait for Hayes to die. They were going to rush the trench, sever the detonator wire before the shell could reach the vent, and slaughter the human. Hayes watched the massive crawler advancing toward the ditch, its heavy plasma cannons glowing with lethal energy. The winch was too slow. The shell was only halfway down the trench. He disengaged the winch. The cable went slack. Hayes grabbed his M88 repeater from the mud. He didn't have tungsten rounds. He didn't have explosives. He only had 1 magazine of standard incendiary tracer rounds, useless against heavy armor, but highly visible. He didn't aim at the advancing infantry. He didn't aim at the crawler. He aimed at the heavy steel towing cable lying in the mud, specifically where it wrapped around the detonator cap of the sliding orbital shell. "You want to see hell?" Hayes screamed, a bloody, terrifying grin splitting his face. He racked the bolt of the heavy repeater. The alien horde poured over the lip of the trench, their weapons raised, a tidal wave of chitin, armor, and fury. Hayes didn't flinch. He squeezed the trigger. Flames erupted from the muzzle of the M88 repeater. Cadet Thomas Hayes held the trigger down, his body shaking violently as the weapon bucked against his wounded shoulder. The incendiary tracer rounds bright. Furious streaks of red phosphorus tore through the rain-slicked air of Tartarus 9, streaking straight down the muddy corridor of Outpost 44. He was not aiming at the charging alien infantry. He was aiming at the steel carabiner locked tightly around the detonator cap of the 2,000-pound orbital shell, resting halfway down the trench. At that exact microsecond, the lead Vrak shock trooper crested the front barricade. Seeing the rigid corpse of Private Samuel Jenkins holding the copper wire, the alien did not hesitate. The trooper leveled its underslung plasma cannon and fired a point-blank blast. Jenkins' frozen body instantly vaporized into a cloud of pink mist and ash. The dead man's grip vanished. The copper wire snapped slack. The detonator switch clicked shut. Simultaneously, Hayes' incendiary rounds hammered into the steel cap. The sheer kinetic friction of the bullets, combined with the electrical signal from the closed circuit, ignited the primary charge. What happened next defied the standard physics of a surface detonation. Because the massive shell had been dragged halfway down the trench, it was flanked by 30-foot walls of highly compressed, reinforced bedrock and dense Tartarus mud. When the orbital-grade explosives ignited, the blast wave could not expand outward in a perfect sphere. Instead, the trench acted like the barrel of a colossal, planetary-scale shotgun. The explosion did not sound like a bomb. It sounded like the tectonic plates of the planet tearing themselves apart. A blinding sphere of white-hot plasma expanded at supersonic speed. The front half of the blast wave roared down the corridor, meeting the advancing Vrak horde head-on. The heavy shock infantry, bred for durability and wrapped in armor that could withstand anti-tank rockets, simply ceased to exist. They were not thrown backward, they were atomized. The plasma wave hit the colossal shield core crawler as it lumbered over the ridge. The multi-ton behemoth's internal reactor breached under the extreme heat, triggering a secondary thermonuclear explosion that vaporized the crawler and the entire command battalion marching behind it. The Crimson Warlord was turned to ash before his optical sensors could even process the flash. But the rear half of the blast wave had nowhere to go except straight down. The concussive force slammed into the bottom of the trench, fracturing the bedrock and punching directly into the subterranean geothermal vent beneath Outpost 44. The immense pressure of the planetary fissure violently decompressed, causing a localized geological collapse. The Earth gave way, swallowing the rear of the trench in a maelstrom of liquid rock, superheated steam, and displaced Earth. Hayes was caught in the exact epicenter of the suction. The shock wave shattered his helmet visor, instantly deafening him, and threw his broken body backward into the collapsing geothermal sinkhole. Darkness rushed up to meet him as tons of boiling mud and pulverized stone rained down, sealing the fissure and burying the remains of Outpost 44 under a mountain of slag. High above the toxic clouds, aboard the human command carrier Aegis, warning klaxons screamed. Lieutenant Sarah Collins gripped the edge of her tactical console, her knuckles white. The holographic projection of Tartarus, 9 flickered wildly as a massive seismic anomaly bloomed across the continent of Oakhaven. Report, the fleet admiral barked, striding onto the command deck. Massive thermonuclear and geothermal event at grid sector 4-4, sir, Collins replied, her voice trembling. She stared at the readouts, a profound, heavy sorrow settling in her chest. The subterranean vent. It's completely collapsed. The crust cracked and sealed itself. The Vraks cannot build the planetary shield generator. The grid is utterly destabilized. The Admiral leaned over the holotable, watching the alien fleet markers. For 3 weeks, the Vrak Armada had held a rigid, impenetrable blockade formation. But now, chaos reigned. Look at their orbital carriers, the Admiral whispered, deprived of their planetary shield, and having just witnessed the complete, instantaneous vaporization of their supreme ground commander and their elite siege battalion by an unidentifiable weapon, the Vrak algorithms broke. Their tactical networks registered a threat level beyond their capacity to calculate. To them, the humans had just weaponized the planet itself. One by one, the massive alien dreadnoughts broke formation. Their thrusters flared blue against the blackness of space. They were not repositioning. They were executing an emergency, uncoordinated retreat. The invulnerable Vrak Armada was running away. Collins placed a hand over her earpiece, listening to the static where a 19-year-old boy's voice had been just moments before. He had done it. He had saved the planet. And he had paid the absolute price. 72 hours later, the toxic storms of Tartarus, 9 finally broke. The sky faded to a bruised, dusty orange, revealing the scarred surface of Oakhaven to the human orbital dropships descending from the Aegis. Major David Caldwell stepped off the ramp of the extraction bird, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Flanked by combat medic Richards and a squad of heavily armed engineers, Caldwell surveyed the devastation. Outpost 44 was gone. The jagged, muddy trench had been completely erased. In its place was a massive, perfectly smooth crater, nearly a mile across. The extreme heat of the orbital shell and the erupting geothermal vent had flash-melted the mud and bedrock, turning the entire battlefield into a solid bowl of dark obsidian glass. It reflected the strange orange sunlight like a dark mirror. "Sweep the perimeter," Caldwell ordered, his voice hushed in the eerie silence. "Look for any Vrak tech that survived, and look for dog tags. If anything is left." The squad fanned out, their boots slipping slightly on the smooth glass surface. They walked over the entombed remains of an entire alien army. Richards knelt near the center of the crater, running a handheld, deep-penetrating thermal scanner over the glass. The device hummed softly, cutting through the dense layers of fused rock. Suddenly, Richards froze. He tapped the side of the scanner, frowning. He moved it to the left, then back to the right. A tiny rhythmic blip appeared on the screen. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it possessed a distinct biological frequency. "Major!" Richards yelled, his voice cracking. "Major Caldwell! Bring the thermal cutters! Right here!" Caldwell sprinted across the glass, signaling the engineers. "What is it, Richards? A surviving Vrak?" "No, sir." Richards stared at the screen, his face pale. "The biological signature is mammalian. It's human, and it's 50 feet down." The engineers moved in with heavy plasma torches, carving a precise circle into the obsidian surface. The glass hissed and popped, giving way to the hollow darkness of the collapsed geothermal tunnel below. They rigged a mechanized winch, ironically similar to the one Hayes had used, and lowered Richards into the abyss. The tunnel was pitch black and suffocatingly hot, smelling of sulfur and burnt ozone. Richards switched on his shoulder-mounted floodlights, sweeping the beam across the jagged rock walls. The structural collapse had created a small, airtight pocket near the bottom of the fissure. In the corner of that pocket, partially pinned beneath the melted chassis of a human logistics truck, lay a figure wrapped in the tattered, carbon-scored remains of a 104th Infantry combat suit. Richards scrambled over the debris, dropping to his knees. He grabbed the figure by the shoulder and gently rolled him over. Cadet Thomas Hayes's face was completely white, covered in dried blood and soot. His breathing was so shallow his chest barely moved. His right arm was mangled, wrapped tightly in a bloody tourniquet made from webbing. But as Richards pressed 2 fingers against the boy's neck, he felt it. A slow, stubborn, refusing-to-die pulse. Hayes had been blown into the cavern just milliseconds before the roof fused shut, sealing him inside a pressurized bubble. The synthetic adrenaline from the medical kit had slowed his metabolism down to a near-hibernation state, keeping him alive in the dark for 3 days. "I have him!" Richards screamed into his comms, tearing open his trauma kit and plunging a wide-spectrum stabilization syringe directly into Hayes's chest. "He's alive! Get the medevac ready immediately!" As the chemical cocktail hit his bloodstream, Hayes's eyelids fluttered. He let out a weak, agonizing gasp, his lungs desperately pulling in the oxygen leaking from Richard's suit. The cadet's unfocused eyes stared blindly up at the medic's floodlight. Hayes's lips moved. Richards leaned down, putting his ear close to the boy's mouth to hear his final report before he lost consciousness. "Did they take the ditch?" Hayes whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves. Richards swallowed the lump in his throat, securing the extraction harness around the cadet's chest. "No, son," the medic replied softly. "They didn't take the ditch. They ran like hell." A faint, ghostly smile touched the corner of Hayes's mouth before his eyes rolled back and he slipped into unconsciousness. 6 months later, after the Tartarus, 9 system was permanently secured by the human fleet, military intelligence cracked the primary encryption algorithms of the Vrak communication networks. Analysts pored over the data from the day of the retreat, looking to understand exactly why the alien commanders had abandoned their greatest strategic objective. They found a single, localized broadcast sent from the Crimson Warlord to the alien high command seconds before his vaporization. The translation became legendary among the ranks of the orbital infantry, a testament to the terrifying potential of human endurance. The Vrak dispatch did not mention orbital bombardments. It did not mention the human fleet. It consisted of a single desperate warning: abort planetary conquest. The human species does not wage war. They manufacture madness. Do not approach Sector 44. The demons guard the mud. Cadet Thomas Hayes went from a forgotten teenager bleeding out in the mud to the absolute terror of the Vrak Empire, proving that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy isn't an orbital cannon, it's a human being, with absolutely nothing left to lose. The Demon of the Ditch secured Tartarus. 9 broke a galactic armada and earned his place in the legendary halls of sci-fi HFY history. If this intense, gritty tale of human stubbornness and survival got your blood pumping, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an epic story. Drop a comment below. What would your final words be to the Vrak emissary? Share this video with a friend who loves military sci-fi. And until next time, keep holding the line.